Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Jin. I'm the host for this presentation. Today, we are so glad, we invited Habib to be our speaker. Let me introduce a little bit about Ideas, the nonprofit organization who manage, this online webinar. Ideas stand for International Data Engineering and Science Association. We are a nonprofit organization. We focus on AI technology conference. We manage a lot of conference at Dallas, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Silicon Valley. Also, every week we have the online webinar. This is for the artificial intelligence technology, data science, big data, blockchain, and all cutting-edge technologies. Today, we are so glad to have our speaker, Habib. Let me introduce a little bit about our speaker. Habib had his PhD degree in laws from USC, University of Southern California. And currently, he's working as a partner in BG Kong law firm. And his background is very strong. He worked with a lot of startup companies, the business, to help them to protect their products, especially in the technology, cryptocurrency, blockchain, ICOs, funds, and mining tools. Help a lot of investors, staff, entrepreneurs. This is a very brief introduction about our speaker, and I would like to pass the microphone to our speaker so we can start today's presentation. Again, thank you, Habib, and thank you every attendees today.
All right, thank you, Jason, for the introduction. I wanted to thank Ideas for hosting this webinar. Hopefully those of you participating can get a little bit out of this. I also want to say this is going to be fairly interactive, so if anyone has any questions in the middle, feel free to chime in and ask, and hopefully I can give you whatever information I can. So to just add a little bit to what Jason said, corporate and securities attorney. I also practice some tax law, and we serve as the outside general counsel for a lot of domestic and international startups and small to medium-sized enterprises. A lot of this has to do with tech companies on the cutting edge, and so it's very interesting to see how innovators like yourselves are sort of pushing the boundaries of not only the U.S. regulatory system, but sort of the international framework here. This presentation will focus more on the U.S. framework, but it's pretty broadly applicable, in terms of the strategies and different things that I mentioned. So the title here is Regulation versus Emerging Technology, Navigating the Mutual Push and Pull of Traditional Regulatory Framework and Innovative Technology. So, if you're an innovator, oftentimes there's innate hate for regulation. You see it as something that is to be avoided, something to, maybe you can find a loophole for, something that hinders your ability to innovate. If you have a solution that you've come up with, the idea many times that you have to see whether or not it works within a certain regulatory framework can be a little vexing, right? Let's look at artificial intelligence in the application of self-driving cars, for example, right? It seems very obvious that applying artificial intelligence, creating self-driving cars, is going to create a more efficient society. It'll prevent accidents. It'll lower the costs of so many different things in society. Now, why does government stand in the way here? Uh, we'll dive a little bit deeper into that later on, right? But it's important to understand that there's some core policy objectives that the government usually has when it's pursuing regulation, right? It either wants to protect the public, it wants to protect you, it wants to facilitate something. And it's not always the case that regulation blocks change or blocks innovation, right? Oftentimes, the system of law and order that we have facilitates change. Having some stability in the government allows people to innovate. Having concepts like social security or bankruptcy gives people the safety they need to go out. Having bankruptcy laws or corporate laws allows you to hide. If you're starting a company, you don't have to worry about debt collectors coming after you personally. You can start and fail and start and fail and start and fail, and this encourages innovation, right? Inherent in innovation is failure, and if people are afraid to fail, that would be a problem. This, goes on to even specifics like non-competes. Certain states have different views on non-competes, like California, for example, will restrict them because it wants to encourage the flow of human capital. So if you're working for Google and then you decide to hop off and create something of your own, many states might have more restrictive non-competes where then you as an employee could not compete against Google. However, in California and other states, they would not allow Google to have that non-compete with you. And in turn, these bright minds can come in and out of companies and contribute to society, right? There's no need for us as a society to wait 2 years then for you to embark on your journey. Patents and trademarks are also very important. If you are innovating, very few people innovate purely for the sake of innovation, or at least the desire to innovate would be a little dampened if you were not able to profit off of that, right? Many of you here are, at the end of the day, if not entrepreneurs, you're looking to make money off of your careers, right? Not all of us can be Nobel scientists working away at a lab, allowing larger corporations or different people to profit off our intellectual property. So being able to apply for patents and trademarks, once you've come up with something, to be able to protect that intellectual property gives you motivation to succeed. Capital formation laws and tax laws. So in different ways, we'll talk about the US specifically. It allows for you to go out and raise money. It also restricts it, which we'll go into a little bit more when we talk about blockchain technology. But these are meant at the end of the day to allow the venture capital system to exist within certain guidelines. Tax laws similarly will provide rebates and funding sources to biotech companies and different industries. So it's obvious that many times the regulatory frameworks and innovation clash. Most recently, you have the very obvious situation with blockchain and cryptocurrency. You can see how this token economy came in and upended a lot of traditional venture capital structures, and enforcement authorities were not very happy about this, and for good reason. I think we found that after the initial hype, there were a lot of projects that were fraudulent, many that just didn't deliver. And we'll again go into this a little bit. There's a reason for the laws that were in place, and blockchain and cryptocurrency initially came in and really clashed with securities laws, money service business laws, with the CFTC, et cetera. But this concept is not new, right? It goes back to even, say, we went from horse and buggies to cars. Obviously, federal laws, state laws, local laws all had to slowly evolve as you had different speed limits. You had to worry about different types of injuries coming from these, different safety regulations. As you're moving at higher speeds, you need things like seat belts, airbags. All of these slowly develop. And at the time, many car manufacturers perhaps think, you're forcing me now to put in seatbelts, you're forcing me now to put in airbags. The cost of the car is going up. People don't want to buy the car as much. And much like us today who innovate and find regulation standing in the way, these people probably thought the same thing. However, these days we think of these sorts of safety regulations, speed limits as common sense. But they had to be enacted as innovation forced the evolution of regulation. And we'll talk about that a little bit. I mean, the internet brought this about in very major ways. All of a sudden, you had things like message boards, online porn, distribution of pirated videos. This was a medium that facilitated a lot of activity that government did not know exactly how to regulate. And government has come at this in different ways. CBD and hemp products is something else that we've been dealing with recently. Within the US, there's been different regulations on, generally narcotics, but then also marijuana, and then CBD and hemp products as well. There used to be restrictions on importing these across state lines. And even though CBD and hemp were shown to have certain benefits, regulation still restricted the availability of these to many people. Social media, another hot button issue. Now, I don't think many of us imagined when we joined Facebook, back in 2007, 2005, whenever this was, that we would be dealing with the sorts of issues we see now. Regulators certainly did not imagine they would have to worry about this until very recently. It was a very nice way for different people to connect. The idea that 10 years down the line, it would be able to influence a national election, that we would be worried about the proliferation of fake news, that we'd be worried about the large-scale collection, right? Big data and the large-scale collection of personally identifiable information on us was not something we could have really thought of. And artificial intelligence, that's sort of, I think, what we're going to see in the future. And sometimes innovation spurs regulation to evolve. So you'll see a lot of, this list is essentially the same. You see the SEC currently, recently putting out a proposed safe harbor for cryptocurrency, and blockchain companies or others tokenizing. You see that the government implemented higher speed limits, safety laws as we move from horse and buggy to cars. And I'm sure we'll see similar situation as we move from cars to self-driving cars. With the internet, there were a lot of different laws that had to be enacted there. Tax laws had to be changed so that business could be taxed properly. If you're in China selling to US customers all of a sudden, and now you don't have to actually come to the US to interact in business, there's a question of which government should tax that activity. At a fundamental level, even that had to change. CBD and hemp products, we've seen a little bit of change in increasingly allowing the movement of these. Narcotics, that's an ongoing battle, but we're moving towards liberalization of, say, marijuana. On the social media side and artificial intelligence side, that's something with which the US government is still very much struggling. On social media, at least, we've seen some evolution in Europe with GDPR and sort of restricting the ability of a lot of sites to collect data and then also implementing the right to be forgotten. So sometimes the evolution is meant to facilitate. At other times, it is meant. At other times, it responds and restricts. Right. When it comes to artificial intelligence and big data, we are likely going to be seeing more of the latter, response and restriction, because you have to look at the broad policy perspectives of the government and what they're trying to accomplish. At the end of the day, cynicism aside, the goal of the government is often to protect its people in some way or from something. Obviously, within that, there will be a myriad of special interests and loopholes put into place, but that is the general idea. They want to be able to go back to their constituency, or they want to be able to address major topics and feel like they accomplished something. So some technologies do necessitate change of regulation. Artificial intelligence will be a big one. On the other hand, a lot of times the laws put into place can easily be adapted to the innovation because those same policy considerations that govern the regulations are pretty broad. And as a case study right now, we'll go look at blockchain. So, brief overview for those of you that are not familiar, and feel free to chime in if any of you have any questions. So what is blockchain? A digital ledger on a peer-to-peer network made up of immutable blocks, and it's decentralized often, so there's no need for any central certifying authority, though we are seeing more centralized blockchains these days. And it started off somewhat with Bitcoin, but it can be used for more than just the transfer of currency. A little bit of history here. It was first mentioned as a concept in 1991. You had a form of it implemented actually in Estonia before the Bitcoin white paper came out, just a few months before. There's a publication verifying that, and then you have the Bitcoin white paper in 2008. Ethereum in 2015 comes along and helps blockchain really take off. I like to think of it as sort of the Wix or WordPress of blockchain. And then today I've talked with companies that have implemented blockchain technology with the World Bank. I met with a company called Avanza Innovations that's doing a lot of work in the UAE as they push to go paperless. And then even in the US, there's government departments that are implementing this in various ways, such as the Health and Human Services. So let's take a look at what regulatory frameworks are going to apply here. First of all, we have the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's sort of where the sexiest part of this has been and where the back and forth has generally taken place. We have the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and they govern a lot of the money service business laws, FINRA, Office of the Controller of Currency, FCC, Federal Communications Commission, and the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission. So what I want to stress here is that a lot of people see blockchain and cryptocurrency and tokens as something new that came about and should not have been covered by a lot of existing regulation. When I first jumped into the space, someone came to me and told me, look, and I didn't know at the time this was blockchain, but they said, I'm developing this platform that's basically going to create tokens from traditional financial instruments, securities or real estate or whatever the case is at the time. This was about 4 to 5 years ago. It was fairly early on. And there was a lot of misunderstanding that simply tokenizing something put it above these laws. And that came with a very black and white reading of what they thought the laws were supposed to do, rather than looking at the policy. And I think that's very important for innovators and for engineers. You know, whoever you are, it's important for you to understand the policy objectives that the regulation is pursuing, so you don't run afoul of those just by thinking you're being smart and finding a loophole. Policy versus black letter law. So while technology changes, this often results in mere shifts in the methods and means through which the same actions are taken. The basic consideration behind regulation, often some form of protecting the public, does not change. Regulation is pushed and pulled by, is pushed by and pulls innovation. So technology might change, but usually the basic idea stays the same. Now, artificial intelligence, we're talking about, say, you know, self-driving cars. Yes, you know, there might be not a need for the same exact institution, such as the DMV, if we have a computer or an algorithm or something getting its license to drive. At the same time, the basic idea that there are certain traffic laws that have to be followed to facilitate, you know, travel, that stays the same. Now, some of those might have to change in a world where we have self-driving cars, right? There might have to be something else besides regular lights. Perhaps the specific rules regarding lane changing, et cetera, might have to change. But the basic concept that this entity that is going to be doing the driving still has to meet certain requirements, and that travel still has to be governed by different requirements, that is not going to change. So, securities law, a lot of you might be familiar with the picture on the right. Normally I would ask, but if no one can chime in, this is obviously Wolf of Wall Street on the right, and on the left here we have an orange grove. So an orange grove is famously the subject of the Howey case. Now, not too different from tokens, someone decided that they were going to sell investment contracts in oranges, and that should not necessarily count as a security because, you know, in some complex way, they were actually selling the oranges themselves. Needless to say, the court ruled otherwise, and we'll go into that in a second. Wolf of Wall Street illustrates my example, or the basic principle that these regulations are put into place to protect the public. Now, securities law really stems out of the idea that if there's no laws put into place, oftentimes the public will be scammed into buying different things. This was not a concern, and, you know, again, looking at how innovation spurs regulation, this was not as much a concern 200 years ago, when, you know, the worst case scenario was someone going from town to town and soliciting people to buy something, right? As we got into an age where print ads were put into place, and then eventually, you know, call centers and people soliciting on a massive scale the public to buy stocks, there was a reason to worry about how the public was being scammed. And that's really where you get securities laws put into place. The idea being that if something is being sold, then there should be information available on it. And that's the idea of going public, right? Or doing an IPO or registering with the SEC. if you're going to be selling to, at a retail level to consumers, investment products, then they should have some idea of what they're putting their money into. And, there should be audited financials, et cetera, so that they're not being fleeced. That is the base of the law there. Now, within that, you have many carve-outs because at the same time, the SEC realizes that there has to be an opportunity for capital formation. If you're a startup, you really need to be able to raise money. So how do you balance the two? So they'll look at considerations like, okay, maybe people with a certain amount of money have more time and more ability, and are able to also bear the loss more if they invest in something, right? When we call them accredited investors. So let's allow them to invest in things a little more than we might allow others to invest into, right? It makes sense. We don't have to worry about protecting them as much. At the same time, funds, large funds with millions and billions of dollars, we have to worry about them even less because they have their own staff that's going to vet these. Jordan Belfort can't just call some venture capital company or Bain Capital and then con them into investing into something as easily. Or if he can, that's really Bain Capital's fault at that point. So we don't need to predict them as much. So there's even less restrictions there. At the same time, we don't want these people going, the people that invest going out and selling to the public. So there's restrictions on secondary trading. Down the line, they say, okay, maybe you want a little bit of investment allowed from the public, and you have Reg CF happen. So you can see how the evolution of regulation takes place, and it's a pretty common sense way, right? You can imagine these problems coming up and regulators responding to them, right? All of a sudden we have phone banks and situations like Wolf of Wall Street. Okay, what do we do? Now we have the age of the internet and information widely available. Maybe the public can more easily access it. Okay, let's put into place Reg CF, regulation crowdfunding. And let's cap that at only $1 million so, no one can get too rich off of it and defraud the public too much. So going back to the orange groves, how this comes into play is, okay, fine, this is the Securities Exchange Commission regulating securities. Now, what counts as a security? The Howie thought that he could sell oranges without actually selling the oranges, and it should be fine. The SEC disagreed, and the Supreme Court sided with the SEC, basically coming up with this test that, not coming up with it, but rather refining the test, but this is where it was made famous, that any investment of money in a common enterprise where there's an expectation of profit from the effort of others would count as a security. So where does blockchain fall on this idea of, regulation? How does regulation fit into blockchain? There's a few different aspects to blockchain, right? There's obviously cryptocurrency, and that goes back to, is it a security? Is it not a security? And there's a lot of different categories in which cryptocurrency which blockchain can have tokens. They can be pure currencies like Bitcoin. They could be utility tokens, which is this sort of unofficial term, like Ether. It could be, a purely internal token, like we have with Pocketful of Quarters or Turnkey Jet, which recently came out with no action letters. Or, you could even have tokenized securities and different things representing already traditional assets or tokenized real estate. However, at the same time, blockchain does have other aspects to it, right? Number one, it creates transparency. Number two, it brings up ideas of data ownership. And three, it could facilitate changes to privacy laws, security laws, and real property laws. So there's potential sea changes to many regulatory regimes, but probably not in the ways people often think. For example, the way it can be implemented within current securities infrastructure could eliminate transfer agents and the deposit and trust company that's used right now. That's not as sexy a thing to change as imagining that tokens are going to, destroy the securities infrastructure the way capital is raised. But those are still important changes that create important efficiencies. So let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. What are some potential regulatory challenges that will arise here? I want everyone listening to think about this for a little bit. This is something that will have a very big impact on regulation in the next, 10, 20 years. And those of you working in the space, whether as an employee or as an entrepreneur, I think it's important to recognize, as an employee, what are you coding for? Right? What are you trying to take into account, and how can you maybe future-proof what it is you're building? Because yes, it might technically fit into what the blackletter law says right now, or maybe none of the current case law or none of the examples currently address this, so you think you're fine. But at the same time, what is the purpose here of the law, and how can you protect against maybe some changes that might have to occur to that? So let's look at this. We have licensure of codes and algorithms. We talked a little bit about this with the self-driving car. Now, how do you decide? Because someone is going to have to decide that the self-driving car is allowed to drive. At what level can this be done if we're thinking through this, right? We currently have a system where you have to have a license to drive a car. Now, if we were to just try to write this off, we could say, oh, it doesn't matter, no person is driving a car, and the law says a person has to have a license in order to drive a car. So really, we can have self-driving cars without any need to worry about approval from authorities. But at the same time, maybe we can expect that authorities will probably require some sort of licensure here, right? How is it going to be done? Potentially, instead of waiting for them to propose something, people like us can go ahead and propose something, right? Maybe there's a need for them to hire auditors to do testing, something where they can take a look at the capabilities of the algorithm, of the code, and make sure that it's okay to go. And some of these other aspects will come into play even when looking at this. So let's talk about anti-discrimination laws controlling data sets. This is another big problem with big data, right? And artificial intelligence. So usually in machine learning, so you have these technologies that train themselves on existing data sets. So I'll give you an example. There's software that's currently used in the US prison system to determine whether or not someone should be granted probation, right? It's a very important thing. Someone's in prison for years and years, and this software is now going to decide whether or not they should be allowed to leave a little early. If you are going to create this kind of software, it has to learn from something, right? What is it going to learn from? Okay, let's look at history of crime or history of recidivism. How often does someone with a certain background go back to a life of crime if they are released early? I mean, it seems like a pretty reasonable way to approach the problem. If they've committed X crime and have only spent Y years in jail, then they're more likely to commit a crime again if they're let out on probation, so maybe they shouldn't be. If they have this sort of personality, if they've committed this many infractions in jail, etc. Now, what is the problem with this is that, sometimes obviously race can come into play. So even if it's not explicit, in some implicit ways, right? For example, African Americans might be more likely to be recidivists, right? To go back to jail. Within the data set, there might be a lot of confounding variables that they have in common. So at the end of the day, what you have is software that technically discriminates against African Americans in deciding who should be granted probation. And down the line, this could, we have generally, I believe, a progressive society that sort of moves forward on these things, right? We recognize that racism is a problem. We recognize that discrimination has been a problem in the past, and we try to alter for it. The idea of having big data and artificial intelligence draw from the past to predict the future potentially cements the past and prevents us from moving forward in a lot of important ways. So that's something to keep in mind. Liability indemnification. Going back to the question of the car, who is going to be liable if there's an accident? Rather than the current set of laws and regulations, we know. If I'm driving my car, I hit someone, I'm liable. If, I violated a certain law, changing lanes, and they hit me because of that, but it was me who violated something or got in their way, then I'm still liable a lot of the time, right? That's been hashed out. It's a very different question when we're talking about, let's say, Google. Now, I've bought the car, I'm in the, technically what is the driver's seat, but Google is the one with the program that's driving the car. So how is this going to be dealt with? If we raise the stakes, now I'm in the driver's seat, and Google, I'm driving this, or in the seat of this Google self-driving car, and the car hits a pedestrian. What happens then? What if I have final control, or there's this big argument that goes on about not even putting a steering wheel in these self-driving cars, because at the end of the day, that's more trouble than it's worth. Even though it provides some comfort to you and I, to at least having a steering wheel in case something goes wrong, really increases the chances of something going wrong, because then we'll take over rather than the computer taking over. So if there's a steering wheel and the car is driving, and I feel like the car has done something wrong, and then I take the steering wheel and try to avoid it, or I try to hit the little girl instead of the little boy, if I have to make that choice, how is the liability on that going to be governed? Right to privacy. So we have to wonder, even with artificial intelligence, now there's a lot of current laws in place, and hopefully GDPR, or maybe GDPR will be expanded. We'll have something like that within the US. So privacy will be protected to a certain extent, but now let's imagine with big data and artificial intelligence, we're able to enter the realm of predictive models. So maybe this expands the idea of what data should be protected, right? So I can, they're not able to they're not able to store my name, my religion, my race, my age, etc. Google might not be able to, but if they're able to store 100 different pieces of information that basically allow them with 99.9% accuracy to confirm my identity, or to predict my identity, or predict what I'm going to do, does that lead to the need to expand the right to privacy, right? If you're an engineer working on something that's this powerful, it's worth thinking about. We'll also have to look at things like tax laws as more work moves into this, digital sphere. How are we taxing that? Currently, it's very easy to tax the work that you and I might do, right, on a day-to-day basis, and we're paid. However, when it is, let's say the self-driving car is taking over for the Uber driver, and suddenly corporate profits are increasing, we have to change tax laws to make sure that the government is still able to get what it needs, and potentially, it needs a little more to cover all these unemployed people. Labor laws, similarly, the industrialization and a lot of progress have allowed us to come into 40-hour work weeks and overtime, etc. But this might need to be changed, maybe universal wage. Love to hear from some of you if you have other suggestions here. So the question is, looking at all of this, what can you do as an innovator, as an engineer? How do you address all of these issues? So number one, you do your research. Number two, don't look for loopholes, but try to understand policy, and then look for creative solutions. And then sometimes it's important to understand that, in different cases, you want permission, and in others, you might want forgiveness. But you really need a good understanding of what the law is, look at what you're trying to accomplish and whether or not and how it fits with the policy objectives of the different regulations you might be running afoul. And then based on that, really, it's important to make an informed decision. So I am going to end this there. This is my profile in case any of you would like to get in touch. I'll open it up for questions. I'll give you all a few minutes here, but if there's nothing, then we'll just close out. But I'd love to hear from you all.
Okay, it's very good. So I think we have a Q&A window. You can type your question there, or we have a chat window. You can type your question there. Okay, so here is one question. So some of the attendees asked me before. I cannot answer the question. So Facebook, I think Facebook has a blockchain products there, right? So for some reason, it's some foreign investors, they want to be involved into the Facebook products. Do you have any detailed information how the product's going? What is the next step? We only see some very few messages from Facebook, but we didn't hear too much recently.
So I won't claim to having any inside information. It's my bet that it does not see the light of day in its current form. I think we've all been aware of the troubles this ran into, the different partners that have come off. It was trying to do too much. So if we look at it from the standpoint of a government, I mean, it could have very easily replaced the economy of many third world countries, right? If we look at M-Pesa now, I think something like a third of all transactions in Kenya take place on M-Pesa. Imagine if something like Facebook were doing this with an alliance of all these companies, right? And they were to go into each country and have their own, have their own different local partners as well, right? That would be devastating for a lot of economies. You would have to completely take a different look on how you're going to deal with these transactions that are taking place purely in the digital space. From the US government's point of view, it was not obviously as dangerous, right? Because if you're the US government, you can always do something about it. However, at the same time, they're aware of the danger that decentralization of the economic system poses. And I think, China's done a great job with this. Rather than wait for some private player to take these steps, they are digitizing their own currency, right? The U.S. government, it could obviously work with Facebook, and it could create this system where Libra is basically the digital currency of the U.S., but that's not going to happen. So I think at the end of the day, what we're going to see is Facebook scaling back to do something more like M-Pesa, because it's still very profitable to get into this game. What I'm seeing right now, sort of within this space, are a lot of smaller companies and startups that are doing their own digital currencies tied to mobile phones and either data or minutes, and then doing microloans paired with that. And that offers a lot of value, right? A lot of data that they get, a lot of users. I think at the end of the day, what Libra will become will be something like that, a very scaled down version with maybe its own internal currency, but not this broad alliance.
Okay. Thank you for your answer. And last question. So, I know some startup companies, they have some, artificial intelligence, products like, face recognition, they want to apply the technology in some, public, context, or, use at a public place. So if they have some, legal problem, what is the best contact information for you if they want to ask help from you? Do you have any contact information this, AI startup company can contact with you?
Sure. So right there on the slide, you can see my email. Feel free to reach out if you reach out and you're more comfortable talking over, Telegram or Signal or WhatsApp. We can go ahead and do that too. Yeah, and I look forward to hearing from any of you that have anything. If you just have some interesting questions you'd like to toss around, just wondering how a different technology will work with different regulations, love to just work through these problems sometimes. And so my information is there. Would love to hear from any of you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think that's all for today. And again, thank you for your presentation, and also, thank you for all the attendees. We can work together during the weekend. I know it won't be easy, and everyone, have a good weekend. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jason, Ideas, and everyone for attending. Have a good night.
Thank you.